Hello, everyone, and welcome to the gathering. It's good to have you in worship. Thanks for being here. My name is Matt Miofsky. If we haven't met, I'm the lead pastor here at the gathering. And I want you to imagine with me for just a second a few scenarios that I came up with. Are you ready for these? Let's think about this. For the third time in a row, one of your good friends bails on you when you're supposed to get together. I mean, you already set aside the time. You said no to other plans. At the last minute, the person doesn't come through. Now, every time this has happened, you've gotten a little bit more frustrated, a little bit more annoyed, and your feelings, quite frankly, have kind of been hurt. You want to talk about it, but you aren't sure the relationship is even worth it. Or think about this. You just get married, and your new mother-in-law just loves to drop by your apartment unannounced. And despite you dropping what seems like obvious clues, the in-laws just aren't getting the picture. Talking about it could be super awkward and open up God knows what can of worms. Or think about this third scenario. You're in a meeting at work and an idea is being shared that you just really think is not going to work. But as is often the case in meetings like that, you're going around the table and everyone's just kind of nodding their head, the kind of groupthink answer. Pretty soon, the boss is ready to move on and you really want to speak up, but you're nervous. You don't really want to rock the boat, and you especially don't want to seem like the only one who's being negative about a particular idea. Now, I want you to think about something. What would you have done in each of those situations? Today, we're beginning a sermon series that I think is just incredibly important. It's called Fight or Flight: How to Handle Conflict. And while we tend to get really creative with our answers on how we deal with things like that, this series is not going to be complicated. It's going to be shockingly simple. See, I think that actually dealing with conflict, we get way too complicated about. And I think that this simple little series actually has the power to change a lot about our relationships starting immediately. I mean, I think this series can immediately change how we experience work or how we experience our boyfriend or girlfriend or our partner or our spouse. It can immediately change how we deal with parents or kids or even our friends. But I'll just say at the outset, dealing with conflict, it might be simple on paper. You might think you know the answers to how you deal with each one of those things, but actually doing it is so much harder for us than we think. Some of us know that we don't like conflict, right? I mean, some of you will say, I just try to avoid confrontation, conflict, even in really little situations. Some of us do almost anything to avoid it. But the real truth is, every single one of us struggles with it, no matter what we say about it. There was this fascinating study that was done several years ago, and as I was researching for the sermon, I read about it. These researchers decided to do a test. They were going to go to movie theaters and just cut in line. And they were going to see if anyone said anything about it. And before they did the experiment, they interviewed a bunch of people. And in the interview, a majority of people said, oh yeah, I would say something. You know, I'm not going to let anybody cut in line with me. And so they tested this, and they actually went to movie theaters, they cut in line, and you know what they found out? In this particular study, not one person actually said anything about it. Now, I know this seems like a relatively small thing, but after the fact, they interviewed people about this situation. When they interviewed people as to why they didn't say anything, the answers were surprisingly consistent. I mean, when people did the mental math, they just discovered that speaking up just didn't seem worth it. Cutting in line didn't seem like that big of a deal, and besides, saying something might just make the situation worse. Therefore, people stayed silent. And now you might be thinking, Matt, I get it. I mean, cutting in line doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but this is the surprising thing. The researchers went on to prove that even in ever increasingly serious situations, people remained silent. That our tendency to not want to deal with conflict, to avoid it, stays amazingly strong. Our avoidance of conflict and potentially awkward or confrontational situations seems to be something like almost all of us are hardwired to do. And it seems like Jesus actually knew that this was true about us. I mean, I think that Jesus knew that if Christians really were going to live differently, then how we deal with conflict had to be part of what we learned to do differently. You see, I think this series isn't just a practical one, although it's highly practical. It's going to change what you do in every interaction. But I also think it's a deeply spiritual issue. See, in a world where I think we have such a difficult time dealing with conflict, and as a result, we have all sorts of weird and toxic relationships, Jesus wants the church to look different. He wants Christians to act different. He wants our relationships to be stronger and healthier, characterized by love. And if Jesus wants our relationships to look different, then I think Jesus knows that he has to help us deal with conflict and confrontation in relationships differently. And so he offered his disciples, as he often does, an amazingly simple but powerful teaching about how they ought to deal with conflict. And the teaching is recorded in Matthew chapter 18. Now, if you grew up in a certain kind of church, this chapter is pretty famous or even infamous as the chapter about how you're supposed to deal with discipline within a church. But I actually think that Matthew chapter 18 is not just about what we do in the church, but it's actually about how we deal with every relationship in our lives. And I think that the principles that Jesus lays out in this chapter, really simple principles, are things that we can use no matter what situation we find ourselves in. And after all, I think Jesus wants his disciples to live differently. And so the principles we learn in Matthew chapter 18 help us to do just that. And so what I want to do to start today is I'm going to read Matthew chapter 18. We're going to study it each of the 3 weeks of this series. I'm going to read verses 15 through 20. And just hear these words in which Jesus lays out some principles about how to deal with conflict or confrontation. He says, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and correct them when you are alone together. And if they listen to you, then you've won over your brother or sister. But if they won't listen, take with you 1 or 2 others, so that every word may be established by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. But if they still won't pay attention, report it to the church. If they won't pay attention even to the church, treat them as you would a Gentile and a tax collector. I assure you that whatever you fasten on earth will be fastened in heaven, and whatever you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven. I'll stop right there. Now, when I first read those verses, you may be thinking to yourself, Matt, I don't get it. Those sound a little weird. What in the world does that have to do with how I deal with conflict in my life? It might be difficult to see how that applies, but underneath it, I actually think Jesus is giving us some very practical, very simple principles about how we deal with conflict in our life. It's as if Jesus knew that the success of us having healthy relationships depended on us being able to figure this out and figure it out well. And so what are the principles that I see in this chapter? I'm going to do something I normally don't do. I'm just going to tell you the 3 principles. These are the 3 things we're going to be talking about each of the weeks of this series. And the 3 principles are this. The first is that Jesus is saying we have to have the conversation. That's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is we have to check your reality. And principle number 3 is to know your outcome. But we're going to start today just with that most obvious, but I actually think most difficult principle, that when it comes to dealing with conflict, the first principle that Jesus teaches us is that we have to have the conversation. I mean, you notice that that's the first thing that Jesus says. If someone sins against you, and when you think sin, I want you to think broadly about that word. I mean, when someone sins against you, I think what Jesus means is when someone hurts you, when someone disappoints you or does something that you disagree with, or even if they just don't live up to an expectation or don't follow through, or when they sin against you, what does Jesus want us to do? The first thing he says is, I want you to go and I want you to have a conversation with that person. Now, over and over, I am amazed at how simple just that one verse is, and yet how difficult it is for a lot of us to do even that. In fact, we as humans, by the way, are hardwired not to do this. I mean, psychologists have shown that in the midst of conflict or confrontation, that we are hardwired to do one of 3 things. And sometimes they'll call it flight, fight, or freeze. Have you ever heard that? The first one is flight, and that's pretty obvious. Like some of us, when it comes to conflict or confrontation, we just want to escape it and avoid the situation altogether. We'll switch departments at work, we'll leave a job sometimes, we'll start avoiding a particular person in social interactions, make sure we're not at the same place at the same time. We'll do anything to stay away from a topic that we know might set our partner off. We just avoid. Some of you are flight type people. Freeze is exactly what it sounds like. Freeze means we sort of don't do anything. We continue to watch a person misbehave or act out or do certain things that bother us, but in our head, we're constantly thinking about it, but we're constantly deciding that it's just not worth it. Some of you know what this is like. You know, you convince yourself that, well, I shouldn't really say anything, or maybe I'm making too big of a deal about it, or the person won't really listen, or it's not going to make any difference. And the more time goes by, the more we think, I can't say anything now, and we feel more and more helpless to do anything about it. We figure that's just the way this person is going to be. We freeze. We don't do anything. And the last option is fight. And at first, this might seem like at least dealing with it, but it really isn't, at least not in the way that Jesus wants us to deal with it. Fighting is when we usually avoid or freeze for days or weeks or months or years, and all the little things pile up until we finally just lose it. Any of you ever done that? We just lose it. And we go to the person, and we let them have it, but it isn't much of a conversation. And usually that kind of angry, I want to fight you now reaction produces nothing more than hurt feelings or a relationship that can even be broken. Now, do any of those sound familiar to any of you? They really should, because each one of us has a default. Each one of us has kind of an MO. It's natural for us to do one of those three things. In fact, to do it differently, to do it the way that Jesus wants us to do it, isn't natural. And in fact, it requires intentionality. It requires us actually learning to do it differently. And oftentimes it requires a lot of prayer, but it can be done. And if we trust Jesus in what I'm about to teach you, we will find that it can transform the way that we experience relationship. And so as an alternative to fight, flight, or freeze, Jesus teaches us that there's a different principle. And the first principle, Jesus says, at least conceptually, is I want you to go and I want you to have a conversation. Now that sounds really simple, but I want to break this down even more simply, because there's a few elements that make what Jesus is asking us difficult, I think, for us. The first is this, that Jesus says, go have a conversation. So I want to remind you that this is supposed to be a conversation. The first element of this principle is it's a conversation. Unlike the options above, Jesus is suggesting that we don't avoid, we don't freeze, we don't fight, we don't run, but instead that we talk. Now, when Jesus first said, I want you to go to a person, it's worth recognizing that in Jesus' day, he didn't have texting, he didn't have Snapchatting, he didn't have phones, he didn't have, email, he didn't have any of that stuff. And so the first thing that Jesus is saying is this is a face-to-face, real-life conversation, old-fashioned Now, I know immediately some of you are thinking, man, isn't texting good enough? Isn't Snapchatting? Can't I begin to address it over email? And the answer is really simple, no. Not according to Jesus. Jesus says, the first element of this have a conversation is it's a conversation. We have to actually go and talk to a person. Do you know why? Because Snapchatting them or texting them or even emailing them is not really a conversation. In fact, most of you know that if you have a face-to-face conversation, it usually goes way differently than anything you'd write on email or anything you'd put on text. Recently I read a book called Fierce Conversations, and the author has made an entire career off of how to have good conversations. I'm going to put the book up on the screen. But in this book, she teaches people how to have real, honest, transparent conversations with people. Not small talk, not beating around the bush, not skipping the surface of an issue, not texting or doing kind of indirect things, but direct and straightforward conversations. And her claim is something that I absolutely believe is true, that when we make time for face-to-face conversations, the results, either at home or at work, they can be incredible. In fact, the author of the book writes that our lives succeed or fail one conversation at a time. And I think what that means is that we shape our relationships by the conversations that we do or don't have. I want you to think about that. We shape our relationships by all the little conversations that we do or don't have. In other words, conversations are powerful. So the first thing that Jesus tells us is that we have to actually have a conversation. The second element of that principle is that we have to have a conversation with who? We have to have a conversation with the right person. That's the second element. Now, who's the right person? This is not a trick question. When you are frustrated, the right person is not your coworker that you can go complain with. It's not going home and complaining about your spouse. It's complaining it to your spouse. The right person is not some third party. The right person is the person that you're experiencing the conflict with. By the way, why is this part so hard for all of us? And I'll put myself in that category. I mean, think about it. An employee who isn't following through, your mother who's doing something annoying, a person in your book club or your core group that dominates conversation and makes it all about them. I mean, people will come and share these kinds of situations with, Matt, what should I do? What should I do with this employee? Or what should I do with my mom? Or what should I do with that person in my core group that just won't shut up? And every single time people talk to me about that, I will say the exact same thing. I will say, have you talked to the person yet? And nearly every time I get a sheepish look back that says, well, I know I should, I need to, but I just haven't. And I want to say, I get it. I get it. There's 100 reasons why we think that having that conversation is going to turn out badly. I mean, we oftentimes have a tendency to think, well, it's really not that big of a deal. It's not worth it. It's not worth bringing anything up. And in fact, when it comes to conflict and when we begin to think, should I go talk to a person, you will immediately do two things. You will overestimate the cost of saying something, and you will underestimate the cost of not saying anything. You know what I mean by that? You will overestimate the cost of saying something. You'll blow up in your head all the things that could go wrong if you actually talk to the person. But what we do is we consistently underestimate the cost of staying silent. We underestimate just how much our relationship with somebody can erode and what it can create over time when we avoid having hard conversations. Let me use a really simple example. This is real life. Someone came and talked to me about this. They're a small business owner, and they have an employee. And this employee is great, kills it, knocks it out of the park, does great work, but they have a tendency to take too much time off. They don't follow the time off policy. In fact, they take too much time. And so the employer had a decision to make. Do I confront this person? And they decided, well, I'm not going to do it exactly. So they decided instead to have meetings with everyone in the company to talk about the policy, to talk about the handbook. They dropped hints, but they stopped short of actually having the conversation. Well, fast forward, a few months go by, and pretty soon what the owner notices is that 3 or 4 other employees begin to do the same thing. They see this person doing it with no consequence. And now all of a sudden, what started as a problem with one person that maybe could have been solved easily is now a problem with 4 or 5 people. When we fail to go and actually talk to a person, oftentimes we underestimate over time just how much that can actually cause harm. And so it makes sense that Jesus says, I want you to have a conversation. I want you to have it with the person. And then the final element of this principle is I want you to be direct. Or to put it a little differently, I want you to directly talk about what's wrong. And so when Jesus says have a conversation with the person and be direct about what's bothering you, about what's wrong. I mean, Jesus is pretty blunt. Listen to verse 15. He says, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and correct them when you're alone together. I mean, think about that. Hello, so-and-so, I'm here to correct you. By the way, that sounds pretty aggressive. I did a little research, and actually what the Greek means is not correct, but to point it out to them. And so a different translation says this: if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. Point it out. Now that sounds a little bit better, but the idea is still the same. There's no hemming and hawing. There's no beating around the bush. There's no slipping it in or trying to hint at it. But instead, Jesus says that there's a directness, there's an honesty, there's a transparency about going to a person, having a conversation, and naming the problem that you're having or what you're experiencing. I thought it was hilarious that in that book, Fierce Conversations, the author notes the errors that we make constantly whenever we try to do this. I mean, if we actually muster up the courage to go to a person, to sit down, to have a conversation, the author says that we often blow it in the midst of the conversation. I have to say I'm guilty of some of this. Here's some of the things, the errors that she says we make. Starting with small talk. Have you ever done that? Like, we want to ease into it. She says, we'll put too many pillows around it. Meaning we so want to kind of make sure that we're not hurting their feelings, that we never get out what we want to say. We over-prepare for their objections. But most of all, she said the most classic mistake is what she calls the Oreo approach. Do you know what that is, the Oreo approach? I learned it as the compliment sandwich. Have you ever heard that? If you're going to say something hard to somebody, like first you say something nice and complimentary, then you say the hard thing, you kind of slip it in, then you end with something nice or complimentary. By the way, if you've ever been on the receiving end of that, you know immediately what the person's trying to do, and you usually don't appreciate it. But in each case, do you notice that we're not listening to Jesus, and we're not even listening to the best wisdom that we have from the world? But instead, Jesus says, forget Oreo sandwich, stop putting all the pillows around it, stop starting with small talk and being afraid, but instead, be direct, be clear, be honest, and be straightforward. After all, we know that when we're on the receiving end of one of those conversations, that's exactly the way we want someone to talk to us. And so as simple as it sounds, the first principle of Jesus is really where we need to start. Dealing with conflict has to start with knowing how to have a conversation. We have to have a conversation with the right person about the thing that's wrong. And I want you to know that to think that that's dangerous or costly or it's going to screw things up is by and large a myth. As we close today, here's what I want you to think about. I really meant what I said at the beginning, that I think this is so important because we are not good at this. And yet I think if we can listen to Jesus on this, it really can change some of the key relationships in our life. So as we close today, I have a question for you, and then I have an assignment for you. The question is this: what's one conversation that you've been avoiding? What's one conversation that you know you need to have, but perhaps you've been making excuses or justifying why you really shouldn't have it? Now, here's the assignment. I want you to name that person. And I want you to spend this week, and I mean it, if you want to journal it, you can, whatever you want. I want you to spend this week giving some thought to why have you been avoiding having this conversation? And what do you think it's cost you not having it? If you would have had it a month or 2 months or a year ago, how could this past year have been differently? And then I want you to think about this question. If you were to go and to have that conversation successfully today, how would that change your life? Now, don't go have the conversation yet. Because next week, we are going to move on to the second principle. It's a second critical step in this process, and that is checking your reality. You may be surprised to know this, but sometimes your view of reality is not actually reality. And that's where Jesus' advice about witnesses comes in. Jesus says in really tough situations, we should bring in witnesses in order to get a better sense of what reality really looks like. But for today, what conversation are you avoiding? Why are you avoiding it? And what would happen if today you were able to successfully have that conversation? Let's pray. Gracious and holy God, I know personally I'm so convicted by this passage, by the clarity and the simplicity of Jesus' words. And I confess that I immediately want to argue, or I immediately want to say, yeah, but what if? Or I immediately want to begin to share why my situation is more complicated. And so God, today, convict me, convict all of us, just to consider your wisdom. to actually wrestle with conversation, maybe one conversation that we've been avoiding. And God, I pray that you begin to move in our hearts to give us the courage to actually begin to think about having a conversation that maybe we've been shying away from. God, ultimately, my prayer is that over the course of the next few weeks, your Spirit would move among us, that you would teach us how to love others better, how to have better and healthier relationships so that we can look more like Jesus. We pray these things in his mighty name. Amen.